Hi everyone, welcome to Yoga LJ. My name is LJ. I'm a yoga teacher and a registered nurse, and today I'll be talking to you about Chaturanga Dandasana. Chaturanga in Sanskrit means 4 limbs. Dandasana means staff, referring to a straight, strong spine. So in English, it's 4-limb staff pose. This is one of the most challenging poses to learn, and it is also the pose where people most commonly get injured on their shoulder or upper arm. So I will share as much as I can with you so you can have a safe, fulfilling practice. I will start by demonstrating what it looks like, and then I'll move into the anatomical cues and alignment of the pose. And then I'll talk about doing this pose with a shoulder, hip, or leg injury. And then I'll finish with modifications. So normally in the Ashtanga practice, we start with modifications for poses, and then we gradually work our way forward to the full pose. And it doesn't matter if you ever get to the full pose. What matters is how you are with yourself when you get into a pose. So we would start the pose after Ardha Uttanasana, after the halfway forward bend, which is this one. We would finish the inhalation and then start the exhalation by pressing your hands down and lift your heels and jump back straight into the pose, Chaturanga. That's what it looks like. So another option is to jump into a high plank and then go to Chaturanga. It's still everything on an exhalation. I'll just demonstrate that so you can see it. From Ardha Uttanasana, from here, start the exhalation, pressing into your hands, and then you would jump back your feet hip width to a high plank. So with practice, you start to jump your feet into the right place. It's normal in the beginning to step your feet to find the right position. From here, you have your low ribs in, engage the anterior serratus, muscles on the side ribs, push your heels back. You bring your chest forward, so your shoulders need to pass your fingertips. And then even though your shoulders are coming forward, you're still pushing your shoulders away from the ears, back. And you bend your elbows midline, Chaturanga. Here, exhaling into it. So that's what it looks like. It takes a lot of upper body strength. So the shoulder joint is a ball and socket joint that's very shallow, allows for a lot of range of motion, but very low stability. And that's why there's so many injuries with this pose or with shoulders in general. Shoulder dislocation is the most common joint that gets dislocated. And the most common muscle injury is the supraspinatus, the muscle at the top of the shoulder. And to prevent shoulder injuries, we want to externally rotate the humerus bone and keep the scapula down and back in socket on the back. And to do that, we engage the mid-trapezius and rhomboids, help to keep the shoulder blades together towards the spine, and externally rotate the humerus. So those actions help to keep your shoulders in place, stable. And basically, Chaturanga, that's exactly what we're doing in Chaturanga. We are doing all those actions, yet it's weight bearing because we're floating the chest off the ground. We're hovering off the ground, just the feet and toes are pressing the floor. So we want to strengthen the biceps and the triceps, and these muscles directly attach to the shoulder joint, which helps keep the humerus bone in the socket. And then we want to make sure our hands are shoulder width, and there's a force of energy in our hands is pressing forward. And that pressing forward, even though our hands are not moving, just a force of energy will further help stabilize the shoulders. The biceps and triceps also are what help bend your arms into the right angle, and they help keep your elbows midline. We don't want to splay the elbows out to the side. That weakens and tightens the shoulder. And then moving towards the chest, we want to engage the pectoralis muscles. So we can do this by pulling the tips of the elbows back towards each other that will engage the pectoralis major and the chest, which helps you hover off the ground. And the anterior serratus are muscles by the side ribs, muscles in between the side ribs. And the anterior serratus helps to keep your scapula on the back. Otherwise, your scapula may wing and lift off the back, and we don't want that. That can lead to injury. So engaging anterior serratus will keep the scapula on the back, and synergistically, they work with the pectoralis muscles. And then the antagonist to the anterior serratus is the rhomboids and the mid-trapezius muscles in the back. So those are muscles in the mid-upper back, about here. And we want to engage those muscles to pull the blades in towards the spine, which further helps stabilize the shoulder. So the combination of the arms with the pectoralis, the anterior serratus, the mid-traps and rhomboids, those muscles will keep the shoulders in socket, very stable in the back. If you have any weakness in those muscles, you'll have a hard time doing Chaturanga, the full version. And then moving down towards the core of the body, we want to maintain the low ribs core active, rectus abdominis, which helps to keep the trunk of the body off the ground. The glutes are active, which helps to keep the pelvis stable, and the pelvis is slightly forward in this pose. The legs are very important because the stronger your legs, the more stable the pose. And actually the heels are pushing straight back, which you may think is counterintuitive because you're rocking forward. But by pushing the heels back, that actually counteracts with the hands and the arms, pushing in opposite directions. So it actually gives more stability to the pose. So I mentioned before in yoga, we often work with opposition, which brings us stability and coming to a place of peace. And when you push the heels back, that's what the calves will be doing that. The calves will activate that action. And then the quadriceps are engaged. So kneecaps are lifting. The inner thighs are spinning back. So inner thighs are moving towards the sky, straight back. So having very strong legs will help support the trunk of the body and also help distribute the weight so you're more stable in the pose. So basically, Chaturanga, we're strengthening the core, arms, back muscles, legs, and ankles in this pose. Moving towards injuries. So if you have a shoulder injury, it can be challenging to retract your shoulder. So I have a left shoulder blade injury. I have nerve damage on my left shoulder. And so I constantly relearn this pose over and over all the time. And I still do the full version, but what I do to compensate for the injury is I shift my weight slightly to the right hand when I'm in a high plank. And I retract my left shoulder back as much as I can. And then I go back to my left side as I bend down to Chaturanga. And so, because it's easier when I'm not weight bearing so much on the left side to retract the shoulder momentarily, and then I go back to even weight. And that's what I do, and it helps me do the pose without any issues. I used to have a lot more difficulty with the pose. Now it's not very much, and the moment I feel anything in my bicep on my left arm, that's usually the first place I feel it, I back off and I relearn the pose. I will slow down everything and try to reshift my weight to find the correct alignment. If you have a hip injury, what happens is that your weak hip is probably not even as the other hip, and that affects the shoulders. If your hips are not even, your shoulders aren't going to be even. So you need to strengthen your hip. So to strengthen your hip, what you can do is push your heel back more. By pushing your heel back more on your injured side, you're activating that leg. There's an energy line going up the leg and strengthening the hip. So for example, if it's your outer hip, you press the pinky toe mound, will strengthen the outer hip. If it's the back of the hip, you strengthen the middle toe mounds, and that will strengthen the back. If it's the inner hip, you strengthen the big toe mound, and that will bring energy up to the inner hip. So depending where your hip injury is, that's where you press into your toe mounds to push your heels back and activate and bring more energy to your legs. And that added energy will bring strength to the pose and stabilize you more in the pose. And for a leg injury, it's similar. You want to strengthen the weak side of your leg. So same concept. And if you have a weak leg, your hips probably are not even either, because if your leg is weak, it's going to drop your hip. And if your hips aren't even, your shoulders aren't even either. They all start to interact with each other. So by strengthening your weak leg, that will keep your hips even and your shoulders even. Same concept. You push back in your toe mounds, depending where the injury is on your leg, to bring more energy up your leg and strengthen the weakness. And that will give more stability in your pose. Now, there are certain injuries that do require modifications. If you have arthritis in your shoulder or your wrist, if you have carpal tunnel in your hands, then it's probably best you do modified versions of Chaturanga to not further add insult to injury. One key thing that I do with Chaturanga and working with injuries is that, or even with weaknesses, you may not have an injury, but you may just be weaker on the certain sides of your hip or legs, is that you can try and explore by activating your feet and strengthening. But the moment you feel a twinge in your arm or your shoulder, any kind of twinge, that's the indication that you're not in proper alignment and you have to pull back and relearn the pose. So that would be your first indication to avoid injury. Because the injuries with the shoulder in Chaturanga, it's a repetitive injury, which means that you can do the pose 30, 40, 50 times. You won't feel anything, but after a while, you'll start to really feel the injuries. It's an injury that creeps up on you. You'll feel a twinge, but you won't think anything of it. You won't realize it's from Chaturanga. You'll keep doing the pose over and over until it gets to the point where the injury is hurting so much that then it's too late once you realize it. Those are the repetitive type injuries that we want to prevent. So the moment you feel a twinge, you just pull back. And now for modifications. So when you start from the halfway forward fold, Ardha Uttanasana, you can jump or step back to a high plank, and then you can drop your knees down. From here, your hands are shoulder width. You just rock, bring your chest forward and come all the way down to the floor. And without realizing it, your hands are in the right place and you're slowly strengthening your upper body. And then from here, we go to Cobra or Upward Dog. So we're almost bypassing the pose, but we're not really. We're still strengthening the upper body. And doing that a few times, you'll get used to the forward movement. Once you're used to that forward movement, you can move on to the next version. So you'd step or jump back to the high plank. And then you would drop your knees down. And then from here, we go to Chaturanga with the knees down. So you engage the core into your serratus. Bring the chest forward, shoulders past the fingertips. Retract the shoulders, elbows midline, and holding here, Chaturanga, exhaling, and then inhale to Upward Dog or go to the floor for Cobra. So that's the other version that's very accessible with the knees down. It's less weight bearing on the shoulders, but yet still strengthening. There's also tips to strengthen the body. I will get into that in a moment. I just want to mention there's 3 things that you should not do in Chaturanga. So one of them is that you should not drop your hips down. So sagging your hips down, you don't want to drop your hips down. And you also don't want to lift your pelvis too high. you want to stay in a straight line. So if you're sagging, you want to engage your core. If you're lifting your hips too high, you want to send your feet back a little more to find more length in the torso. The last thing you don't want to do in Chaturanga is drop your shoulders past your elbows. So it would look like this, where you drop your shoulders lower than your elbows, and that is going to bring you to injury as well as destabilizing for the shoulder. You want to stay at the right angle. However, if you're doing Chaturanga on your knees, you can go less than the right angle. So you can go just here and push back up. That's fine. You don't have to go all the way to the 90 degrees. You can go halfway. You just don't want to drop lower than the right angle. Okay? And then 2 tips to strengthen the body. One of them is to use a block between your thighs. So this will help to strengthen your legs and find your inner thighs. You can start in a high plank from here and work in a high plank, finding strength in your legs. Or you can also drop your knees down with the block and go down to Chaturanga. You're still going to be squeezing your thighs with the knees down. Or you can also do the full version with the knees off the floor from here. So this really helps to find the strength in the legs and pushing the heels back. The other tip to find alignment in Chaturanga is to keep your elbows midline. Sometimes people have a hard time bringing the elbows in, and using the strap can help. You can bring it above your elbows, shoulder width, and you can come onto your knees. You can start on your knees. Hands are shoulder width. From here, you engage your core, shoulders past fingertips, straight arms. Engage the back rhomboids, mid-traps. Bend your elbows. And you can see how the strap rests on my low ribs. And then option to bring your feet back and hold from here and work like that. And that really helps to give awareness in the pose without being so weight bearing. So those are the modifications, and I hope this was helpful for you and that you find your Chaturanga safely. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on below. Namaste. Thank you.